Andrew Rodney is a graduate of Kent State University and has a master's degree in public administration from Wright State. His prior work experience includes Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, City of Dayton, City of Centerville, Village of Evendale down in Cincinnati, and worked at the City of Miamisburg since 2022. He serves as staff liaison to the BZA and Planning Commission and coordinates the city's planning and development initiatives. Andrew is the current section director for the Miami Valley section of the American Planning Association. Andrew?
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. So I want to thank you all for having me here this afternoon. Again, my name is not Keith Johnson, City Manager. I am Andrew Rodney. I am the City Planner for the City of Miamisburg. I've been doing this since 2005. I can't believe it's been almost 20 years, which is crazy to even think about. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about planning and zoning. What I'm not going to do is bore you with the history of zoning or the history of planning and that sort of thing. What I want to talk to you about is kind of the nuts and bolts of planning that you're going to experience as an elected official and what sort of decision making that you're going to be doing as part of your role as a city council member. At any point in time in the presentation, feel free to raise your hand or call out if you have a question or require any kind of clarification. Happy to answer all those questions as we go along, but I'll try to leave about 5-10 minutes or so at the end for a little bit of Q&A. So again, we'll talk a little bit about the roster of players, so kind of the folks that you're going to be dealing with as you're making decisions related to planning and zoning in your communities. Oh, before I get started, who here is is with the city, elected official with the city, and then township folks? Maybe township folks. We got one. Poor Brian is the only township folk guy here. Carry the flag, Brian, carry the flag. We'll also talk about a couple of the key elements, some of the, specifically the regulatory documents that you're going to be dealing with as part of your role as a city council member when it comes to planning and zoning. Talk a little bit about some of the hot topics. Ken kind of stole my thunder on one of them, but we'll kind of talk a little bit about housing from a planning and zoning perspective. Talk just briefly about certification, professional development, things you should encourage amongst the staff, the folks who are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. A few do's and don'ts, mostly just please do's and don'ts when it comes to interacting with planning and zoning in your community, and then a couple of resources as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the roster of players first and kind of each of their roles. So in your communities, you may have a titled person called a development director. Sometimes this person oversees planning, zoning, the building department, that sort of thing. So you may come across this particular individual. Most of the time, they are not going to be the person in front of you, say, presenting on a zoning case or a planning case. They'll be mostly there overseeing the zoning, building departments, code enforcement. That's kind of the role this person does. Smaller communities, they may serve multiple functions. Larger communities, they're typically like a department head working directly under the city manager. Most communities have either a city or a township planner and or a zoning administrator. Now, there's a slight difference between those two types of individuals. Again, larger communities will have both typically. For example, at the City of Dayton, they have a planning director, but they also have a zoning administrator. They work in different areas. Where in a lot of communities, the township or city planner and that zoning administrator are actually one and the same. My case in Miamisburg. So your city or township planner is basically the individual who manages your planning functions. So your comprehensive planning, your zoning codes, your questions of interpretation of the code, things like that. Your city planner typically deals with that. The zoning administrator is a little different. They kind of work in concert with the building official, where when a particular item comes in to get a permit for construction, the zoning administrator will review those permit documents and make sure that whatever is being proposed meets the zoning code requirements for building height and setbacks and landscaping and parking and lighting and all those sorts of things. So more than likely, again, you're going to be dealing with, whenever you're acting as an elected official, you're probably going to be dealing with your city or township planner, not necessarily the zoning administrator in most instances. The code enforcement officer, that person you will almost never deal with unless you get a phone call from somebody who's very upset about something that the code enforcement officer is requiring them to do. The code enforcement officer, he or she is a person out in the community actually driving around and doing code enforcement. Those are things for like building code violations, property maintenance code violations, and zoning violations. So that person is out in your community doing actual enforcement on the ground. Very similar to a police officer, just without a badge and a gun. In most communities, they have the ability to issue citations, to force folks to perform, and take folks to court if necessary. So the zoning officer typically has the ability to do that. So more than likely, again, the only time you ever hear about your zoning officer is when you get a phone call at 9 o'clock on a Friday night because someone is upset that code enforcement's making them move their RV or making them replace their fence or whatever it may be. City Township Engineer, the Public Works Director, so that individual, again, it's in a different department, obviously, but they typically work hand in hand with your city or township planner when larger developments come in for a review. So if you're building a new Kroger in your town or a new housing subdivision in your town, typically the city planner, that city engineer are going to be working hand in hand as we go through the development review process. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But so at a staff level, that's where most of that interaction occurs. You'll probably be dealing with them as it comes to like street sweeping and plowing and paving roads and that sort of thing. But from a planning perspective, that's kind of their role. And then your law director, your municipal attorney, your township solicitor, whatever term that is used in your community, that person basically makes sure that the city planner and your zoning administrator are correctly interpreting the zoning code as it relates to primarily decisions made at like a state Supreme Court or a national Supreme Court level. Make sure that your code meets all of those decisions for constitutionality and that you're not making decisions, or they're not making decisions that are arbitrary or capricious in any way, shape, or form. So that's they're that gatekeeper when it comes to the decision-making process. So those are kind of the roster of players. Did anyone have any questions about sort of the different roles? So these are the folks you're going to run across, again, mostly as part of your role as an elected official. So the next we'll talk a little bit about, there are mostly two, but sometimes three boards that you'll be dealing with when that will be dealing with planning and zoning decisions that then will come up to you. First and foremost, as an elected official, your role is to fill these boards with members of your community. Typically, they have to be residents in most instances, but in some charters, especially in smaller communities where you just have fewer people to choose from, oftentimes they'll allow, say, business owners or property owners, even if they don't live in town, to serve on one of these boards or commissions. So you just need to look at your individual charter, figure out who's permitted to serve on your boards, your planning commissions, your boards of appeal, and things of that nature. When it comes to selecting as a staff person, when it comes to selecting folks for these boards, it is very, very important to thoroughly vet these individuals before placing them on your boards. They are going to make decisions that will impact your community for years or decades into the future, so it's certainly not something to take lightly. You want to make sure that they meet the philosophy of your elected body, that they meet your expectations as far as especially things like attendance and participation, and that they again, meet your philosophy that you want to have for land use and land development in your community. You may have your buddy Jim next door who's a swell guy, and you want him involved, but you want to make sure that person, again, is prepared to serve on these bodies, because throwing them into the fire is essentially what you're doing when you're putting them on one of these boards. You want to make sure that you have people who can fill those roles well. In addition, a lot of folks, probably folks in this room, have already served on one of these two boards before becoming elected officials. These are oftentimes stepping stones, Brian being a good example, of serving on one of these boards or commissions and then elevating up to an elected body. So again, putting smart, good, hardworking people on these boards is first and foremost an important thing for you folks to keep in mind. So what do they do? Your planning commission is your essentially a policy-making recommending body to the city council. So most of the issues that they deal with is they are the first review body for zoning changes. So when someone wants to change the zoning of their property, when a text amendment needs to be made to your zoning code, that will often come in front of the planning commission first as a public hearing. These are both public hearings. Most of the time they do site plan, site plan review. So that is anytime you have a commercial or industrial development come through that requires some sort of site plan review, that'll go in front of the Planning Commission. And then in some instances, Planning Commissions also hear what's called a conditional use. So a conditional use is a certain type of land use that requires extra scrutiny before being established at a particular location. So it's not a by right use where, if you want to do retail in a strip center, you can just come in, get a permit, and go do it. It may be a different type of use that just requires a heightened level of review, so that may go to your Planning Commission. So those are kind of the four main things that a Planning Commission does. When it comes to zoning changes, text amendments, subdivisions is the other item. So they will also review subdivisions. When someone wants to subdivide property, that will come to a Planning Commission first and then oftentimes come to you as an elected body second. So in most instances, your Planning Commission is a recommending body. So they will hold a public hearing. Invitations will be sent for folks to provide testimony. The Planning Commission will review all the material put together by most often the city planner in a meeting packet and a report that they provide. And they will recommend a course of action. And that course of action will be sent up to the elected officials, your city commission, city councils, township board of trustees. And then you folks will be the final arbiters of those decisions. I need to put this pen on my hand. And it's you folks who will make the final decision. In many cases, at least, for example, in Miamisburg is a good example, a recommendation from the Planning Commission is an item that has extra weight. So typically speaking, as a council member, it's a majority vote. It's a simple 4 to 7, 3 out of 5, 2 out of 3, whatever the makeup of your board is to make a majority. For example, in Miamisburg, if the Planning Commission renders a recommendation to the City Council, if it's a positive recommendation, for example, City Council can approve that with a simple majority. If City Council wants to override that decision, it takes a supermajority. So in Miamisburg, a supermajority is 5 out of 7, where a regular ordinance can be approved 4 to 7. So that's why it's important, again, to appoint good folks to these boards, because they may make decisions that are going to be very difficult to be reversed at the elected official level if it's a decision you folks don't like. And so check your charters. Those are oftentimes in your charter or in your zoning code that shows, that kind of gives what the voting requirements are. So that's Planning Commission. Board of Zoning Appeals, this is a quasi-judicial body that hears mostly variances. So a variance is an exception to the zoning code. If I want an exception to some specific requirement of the code, that goes to your Board of Zoning Appeals. Often other items that they hear are appeals to decisions of the zoning administrator or a code enforcement officer or the city planner. So if somebody gets a notice of violation for a specific code violation and they don't agree with the interpretation of how the code was interpreted in that particular instance, they would appeal that decision to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Sometimes the Board of Zoning Appeals also hears those conditional uses. It just kind of depends. Some communities that goes to the Planning Commission, some to the Board of Zoning Appeals. In some communities, these are actually one and the same. I did forget to mention that. In Centerville, when I was there, we only had a Planning Commission. We did not have a BZA, so it served both functions. Most communities, they have two different boards because they kind of have two different functions. The difference with the Board of Zoning Appeals is more often than not, I would say probably 95% of the time, if anyone wants to appeal a decision of the Board of Zoning Appeals, that goes to the Court of Common Pleas. That does not go to the elected body. You folks do not review that. You do not see that. You do not have the opportunity to weigh in on that decision. That will go to the courts, and the courts will weigh in on whether or not that decision was made in accordance with whatever the rules and regulations were in place to make that decision. So that's, again, an important thing to note as well. The Board of Zoning, if you have a neighbor that has a variance request or a friend or relative or whatever, or just a regular constituent, and they are denied and they're unhappy about it, as an elected official, there's almost nothing that you can do about that specific decision. We'll talk about here in a second what you can do from a regulatory standpoint, but as far as that specific decision, more often than not, there's not an opportunity for you to weigh in on it. It goes, if they want to appeal, it goes to the Court of Common Pleas and goes through the judicial system. The last board I'll only speak about briefly because not every community has one. Architectural preservation boards, landmarks commissions, if you've heard that term. These are boards that, again, also appointed by the elected officials, but they make decisions on either locally designated or nationally designated historic districts. So if you have a historic district in your community, more than likely you have one of these boards. If somebody wants to make an alteration to the physical makeup of a building, that decision more often than not will go in front of a board like this, a landmark board, an architectural preservation board, for a decision. Oftentimes, some communities, those decisions can be appealed to the elected bodies. Sometimes those decisions also have to be appealed to the Court of Common Pleas. So it just kind of depends. But if you don't have an historic district, either locally or nationally designated, you more than likely don't have one of these. One other area I didn't mention here, a lot of communities have HOA boards, have HOA rules and requirements. Those are also things, that I don't enforce. I don't know how many phone calls I've gotten over 20 years asking folks to enforce HOA rules. We do not do that. The local body does not do that. We have no authority whatsoever in regulating HOA regulations or covenants and restrictions on plats. So if there's a covenant on a plat document, we have nothing to do with that. That's a civil matter that basically landowners have to take up with each other. So just keep that in mind. If you have an issue with your HOA board, please don't call me. So some of the other public bodies and individuals, citizens, residents, business owners, property owners, these are the folks who are going to show up at your meetings, and more than likely they are going to be upset about something. And that's because anytime that there's a public hearing, you are required to send public notice. Now, that's not always consistent as far as how far out, distance-wise, from the location that you have to go. In Miamisburg, it's 200 feet. I think in Centerville, it was 300 feet, if I remember correctly. So folks who get those notices are the ones who are going to be most impacted by whatever decision is going to be made. So they're the ones most likely to show up. And more often than not, they're not happy about something. And that's just sort of the name of the game. And but those individuals have a right to come to the meeting. They obviously have a right to speak. Some communities limit the amount of time that they have to speak, or they ask, if you have 10 people, can you just have one spokesperson, that kind of thing. Your planning commission and your BZA and your AP, your landmark commission, should have a set of policies, rules, and guidelines for how they conduct their meetings. I would certainly make sure that they have that. If they don't, I would encourage them to adopt a set of rules, because then that way everyone understands how meetings are to be run and what the expectations are for a decorum and things like that. So those are good things to have. You'll always have a developer or some sort of representative, an architect, an engineer, a landowner, what have you. So that person will be there typically representing the applicant and speaking on behalf of the applicant. And then, of course, you folks, the city council, your board of trustees, again, you folks are the final arbiter in many instances, but not all. So just kind of keep that in mind, obviously, as you're going about your business and making your decisions. So what are some of the key elements? So what are there's kind of two I want to talk about, two categories. The first one here is your legislative codes. These codes carry the weight of law. And I want to make that point very specific, because I think in a lot of instances, folks see traffic laws and I don't know, property maintenance. Well, property maintenance is not a good one, but other parts of your code that are enforced by your police department as more legitimate than things like your zoning codes and your subdivision regulations. And factually, that's just not the case. When you adopt codes in your community, they carry the weight of law, whether or not they're enforced by a police officer, a city planner, or a code enforcement officer. So the idea is you're not, as administrative folks, we don't have the ability to bend the rules or to interpret the rules differently than as they're laid out and as they're adopted by the legislative body. You may not like the rules, and we'll talk about that here in a second, and you have the ability to change those rules, but as they're written, it's my job as the planner or the zoning official or the code enforcement officer to interpret and enforce those codes as they're written and adopted by the legislative body, in this case, you folks. So the first such is your charter. So your charter oftentimes, it will lay out the different boards and commissions that you folks adopt and sort of what their roles and guardrails are. So if you read your charter, oftentimes it'll say that you can appoint a planning commission. It has these powers and duties. It has these many people appointed. They're appointed every 2 years or 4 years or whatever it might be. So your charter is that kind of obviously the birth certificate for your community, and that will lay out the rules and regulations for how you kind of begin the land use regulatory process. Your zoning code and your development ordinance. In Centerville, we had a unified development ordinance. I'm not a big fan of those. We can talk about that offline. But your zoning code is that set of rules on how land use is implemented in your community. Previous speaker Ken kind of talks about those local issues that you folks deal with here at the local level. Zoning is about as local as it gets. Every community has their own zoning map, their own zoning code, their own set of zoning rules, and they're unique from community to community to community based upon what your values are as a community. So it's not important that you necessarily read your zoning code. If you want to geek out, go right ahead. But it's something you want to be familiar with and understand, at least at a kind of a high level, what your zoning code requires, what your processes are. Those are always good things to kind of get a good understanding of. And if you don't, I certainly encourage all of you as newly elected officials, set up an appointment with your planner, your zoning administrator, your code enforcement folks. Sit down, pick their brain for an hour. Ask them, what's your daily, life like? What is it that you do on a day-to-day basis? What's the zoning code? What sort of requirements does it have? What are some of the challenges you deal with? Those are important things to understand because, again, when you get zoning cases, you're looking to that document as to whether or not you can or can't, whether or not you can pass it or, you should deny it or whatever. Subdivision regulations, a lot of these in communities are super old. A lot of these actually predate zoning in many different cases. So if you have a set of subdivision regulations where the adoption date starts with a 196 or a 197, it might be time to take a look at those and maybe think about reviewing those, at least with your staff, to maybe bring them up to a modern standard. A lot of times subdivision regulations were adopted just back in the day, 60s and 70s, when just housing developments were exploding all over the place. And really the first line of defense on regulating that development were subdivision regulations, but many of them haven't been touched since. And then last, your property maintenance code. A lot of communities adopt the International Property Maintenance Code just by statute. They'll just have a simple ordinance that says we adopt International Property Maintenance Code, boom. And then that's what they use for their code enforcement. Some communities actually take that code as a base and then maybe manipulate it based on what they want as a community or what's important to them. Some communities just completely ignore that and adopt their own property maintenance code. So it's really not something you need to be familiar with because you're never really going to deal with it. But it's just when you have that phone call at 9 o'clock on Friday night and someone is complaining about a citation that they received, at least you kind of know where that came from and what that requirement was generated from. I got an asterisk after those last three. At minimum, those should be reviewed by your staff on a yearly basis. No zoning code or subdivision regulation or property maintenance code is perfect. There's always instances where there are gray areas where maybe your code isn't working the way that you want it to, or it's not serving the function that you hoped it would. That's an important time to evaluate your codes or ask your staff to evaluate your codes and then come back to you with a solution and how that particular issue can be fixed. If you have a board of zoning appeals that's issuing dozens of variances every year for all manner of different things, your code probably isn't working. Your board of zoning appeals should be relatively quiet all year long unless they get kind of a very niche or specific issue that they have to deal with. But for example, in Miamisburg, I'll use that example, corner yard fences, huge issue. Every community, I swear this is an issue in every community. Corner fences is like a massive thing. If your board of zoning appeals is consistently approving variances for things like corner fences over and over and over and over and over again, and you folks are generally happy with the decisions that they're making, just change your code. Just figure out what those decisions are, what the pain points are, change your code. It makes my life a lot easier. It makes the lives of your Board of Zoning Appeals and your Planning Commission members easier. They don't want to go to a meeting every single month and have a docket that's 15 things long that they have to go through, and they got a 3.5-hour meeting. That's rough as a volunteer. These people are volunteered. You can't pay them to serve on these boards and commissions. They're there on their own time and on their own accord. And they can quit anytime they want. So you want to make sure that their time on those boards and commissions is valuable. And making sure that your codes are working for your community is one good way that you can do that. So make sure your staff is taking a look at those every single year and bringing to you modifications that meet your expectations for land use in your community, whether it's a fence, a shopping mall, and everything in between. The next set are your policy documents. So these don't necessarily carry the weight of law, but they help staff people understand your positions on items, and they also help when we're having conversations with developers or property owners about sort of what the community as a whole, the expectation for land development in the community as a whole. In Ohio, comprehensive land use plans are not required. In many states, your comprehensive land use plan is like the Bible of land use development in your community, and everything else sort of generates from that document. That's not the case in Ohio. You can or can't have one. You can adopt one and ignore it. There's no requirement that you actually pay attention to what's in your comprehensive land use plan. Now, I think it's a good idea you have one because it initiates a lot of conversations that are way more comfortable to have in a non-public hearing setting where it's 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night and you have a room full of angry people. That's kind of where, when you have a good land use plan, that is a good guidepost for your staff. It's a great thing to have, really it is, because when we're meeting down with folks, we can have conversations about this is what your city council has adopted as a land use expectation in our community. Yes?
So if it's adopted, it still doesn't mean you have to follow it.
Correct.
What is being suggested, it's just policy that's guarded.
That's correct, because comprehensive land use plans are a 30,000 foot level. Most of the land use decisions are way down here, so they don't always apply perfectly. What I don't recommend is adopting a plan and then purposely making decisions that obviously go against the plan on a consistent, regular basis. Because if you end up in a court situation, that may get brought up as an issue. So if you adopt a land use plan, I recommend following it. And if you're not following it, then update it so that you can follow it. But it's not required that you have one. Some communities adopt strategic plans, 3, 4, 5-year strategic plans. I won't go into that, but a lot of that, some strategic plans have policies that relate to land use and planning and zoning. So if you have a strategic plan, that would obviously be another short-term guidepost for your planning staff. Your budget and capital improvement program, that the amount of money you allocate to your planning and zoning functions and to your code enforcement functions has an impact on the quality of the staff that you can hire, the quality of the work that they can do, their ability to conduct specific land use studies, for example, or to hire special consultants if there's a particular issue that needs looked at. That comes out of obviously the annual budget. The capital improvement program obviously deals with capital improvements, but things like your parks, investment in your parks, investment in your roads, investment in your infrastructure, all that has an impact on land use. So it may not have a direct correlation, but your ability to invest in those items will obviously have an impact on what's happening on the private land use side of things as well. And then we have other plans and policy documents, small area plans. Those are like if you have specific areas of town that you want to do a specific study for some reason. I highly, highly, highly recommend small area plans. If you have a part of your town, it's like right in the middle of town, an old shopping center, or maybe like a vacant piece of land that's been sitting there for 30 years, my advice is to do a small little area plan. Talk to the folks who live nearby. Talk to the folks who own property adjacent to it. Talk to the property owner themselves. Come up with at least a plan of action where if something does come in the door, you've already had a lot of those conversations about what the expectation is in advance. So you're not having them in the middle of a public meeting with 30 angry people in the room. So I'm a big, big proponent of small area plans for those parts of town that are going to be sensitive if a development ever comes, if somebody ever comes in with a development. you don't want to have those conversations for the first time when a proposal is on the table. I would do it well in advance, so at least everybody knows what the expectation being. And then if somebody does come in, you can say, look, I got this area plan that says the community doesn't want what you're proposing. You can move forward with it if you want, but you're going to get a lot of pushback, and it's going to be ugly. And a lot of times they'll push back from the table and say, I appreciate you letting me know, rather than wasting all my time and money to go through a process where I'm just going to get beat over the head. Consequently, alternatively, if you have a small area plan and it calls for a certain land use, maybe your economic development folks can go out there and start talking to real estate people or developers saying, hey, we might have an idea for a project in town. Would you be interested? And you might be able to kind of initiate some conversations about maybe a type of development that you want to see. So small area plans, big proponent of those. Thoroughfare transportation plans, most of those talk about when you come to your subdivisions. So you're talking like how wide are your rights of way, what sort of infrastructure that you want, sidewalks, hiker-biker paths, roundabouts, what type of infrastructure, roadway type infrastructure that you want when development comes through. So that's what those are. And then you have other types of plans, parks plans, utility plans, county regional plans. A lot of those will come into play as well. So talk a little bit about hot topics. Ken kind of talked about this a little bit. If you're not paying attention to housing in your community, you're doing I would argue, you're doing a disservice to your constituents. This is a huge issue for a lot of different reasons, but especially in planning and zoning. There's an undersupply of housing in what I would consider desirable locations. And then in a lot of cases, those easy locations are already taken. Most of the stuff that's left is harder and harder to develop. And as an elected official, you have the opportunity to impact how hard it is to develop those properties through some of the things that you can do from a legislative standpoint. You've got skyrocketing borrowing costs, skyrocketing material costs. Those are just going through the roof, and it's not getting any easier for developers to build housing either on an infill site or a greenfield site. So there's a couple things that you can do as a legislative body to help mitigate some of that. One is regulatory or design requirements. So again, this is where you look at your zoning code, you look at your subdivision regulations, you talk to your city engineer, you talk to your city planner. What sort of, are there opportunities where you can build into your either approval process or your design requirements that saves a little bit of money? I'll just use one example. A lot of developers want to use, like, for example, plastic pipe for water infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure because reinforced concrete pipe is like 5 or 6 times more expensive to purchase and install. So they want to use a slightly less expensive material to save them money to help make the development sort of move along a little quicker. Now, whether or not from a policy standpoint you want to allow that sort of thing, that's a conversation to have with your staff is, what can we do to make development less expensive in our community? You may be able to make the regulatory approval process shorter, so that saves time, which saves money. Or you can look at what you require from an infrastructure standpoint. Maybe there's opportunities to save money there too. So just something to keep in mind, and that's something that you can influence as a legislative body. NIMBYs and bananas. I think everyone knows what a NIMBY is. A banana is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So these are the folks, unfortunately, it's sort of the I'm the last one in the door, close the door behind me, no one else is allowed in. And these are difficult conversations to have because obviously those folks are the ones that show up to your meetings and raise hell about something that's happening in the community, in the parcel next door to them. And in a lot of ways, that's hampered a lot of housing development in our communities, both single family, 2-family, multifamily. Some of their issues can be legitimate, but some of them are just, plain old fashioned. I was told that was going to be a cornfield forever, and that's what I want it to be. And there's really nothing you can do to fight that belief. But what I just encourage you to do is that land use decision making isn't a popularity contest. It's not one developer versus 50 residents. You have to take the information that is provided to you by your staff, Take a look at your zoning code and the rules that you have put in place to make decisions, and make sure you're making those decisions based on those rules. Understand you're an elected official. To a certain degree, that is a popularity contest, and I certainly understand that. But when you're making decisions, especially when it comes to land use, doing that based on popularity is not a good idea, especially if you end up in court. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an attorney, I'm not going to give you legal advice. But I can tell you, if you don't make good decisions based on the information you have in front of you and the rules and regulations that you have in place for making those decisions, you're setting yourself up for a lot of pain. And then I know Ken talked about it a little bit. He doesn't believe that legislative preemption when it comes to housing is on the horizon. I'm not a fortune teller. I can't tell you whether or not that's true, but it's happening in states all over the country. It's happening in red states. It's happening in blue states. It's happening in purple states. It's happening everywhere. And to believe it won't come here, I think, is selling yourself short. So I would take a look at what you can do in your community to promote housing, either whether that's with a carrot or a stick, and make sure that your codes and your fiscal opportunities where you can provide tax incentives and things like that, or your regulatory environment, all of that is kind of set up to promote housing development wherever it may be proposed. Obviously, you can't control somebody coming in to wanting to build something, but what you can at least do is make it relatively easy for them to come in and at least start that conversation. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't put in guardrails to make sure that fits whatever your community philosophy or vision is, but you certainly want to make it at least relatively much easier than it has been, I'd say, in probably the last 2 decades to get housing in your communities. Some other hot topic land uses, I won't go into great detail with some of these, but these are some of the other ones that you're going to run into. Marijuana is a big one, mini self-storage facilities, dollar stores, multifamily housing, gas stations, data centers. These are all things, if you don't like these and you don't want them in your community, none of these are protected land uses. Things like sexually oriented businesses are protected land uses. You are obligated and required by the Supreme Court to allow them somewhere in your community. You can put rules in, you can make them get licenses and all kinds of different things, but you cannot prevent them from being in your community. These you can, and whether or not you want to or not is, again, a land use sort of policy conversation to have. My time in the village of Evendale, while I was there, we wrote specific regulations outlawing dollar stores. Community didn't want dollar stores, so we wrote specific definitions for dollar stores and said they were prohibited anywhere in the city. Same thing with mini self-storage. We prohibited those in Evendale. The city of Centerville just implemented a moratorium against mini self-storages. I don't know for how long. Medical marijuana or recreational marijuana, if you don't want it in your community, just outlaw it. Don't bend yourself into a pretzel trying to figure out how to make it work in your community. If it's not something that meets your community philosophy and goals and expectations, then I would, again, from my perspective, it's just easier just to ban it. Then that phone call is about 2 seconds long. Data centers, they take up a bunch of room and they employ almost nobody. So those are land uses that obviously they're spreading like wildfire all over the place, so that's something to keep in mind. Industrial solar farms, that's mostly an issue really out in the rural areas. Probably not something a municipality will typically deal with. Group homes and fair housing, that's another area. You may get that 9 o'clock Friday phone call where somebody's complaining that there are 5 unrelated people living in a house next door and they have cars and I don't like it and I don't think they should be able to live together. As long as you're acting as a single household unit, as far as I understand, you cannot prevent the number of folks that can live in a home. As long as it's safe, it's sanitary, it meets your property maintenance regulations, it could be 2 unrelated people or 10. As long as there's really no way that you can prevent that. They can be ex-offenders, they can be in recovery, they can be sex offenders. You cannot prevent these folks from having access to fair and safe housing. Now, If they are receiving services in the building, or if there's like a live-in, somebody's living there providing them services 24 hours a day or whatever, that may be a different type of land use. But the fair housing folks have sent out letters, I think for the last 15 years, to like everybody, saying, just making them aware that everybody has a right to fair and clean and safe housing in your community. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But again, kind of in that red, make your intentions clear. If you don't want these, or consequently, if you do want these, make sure your staff knows that. So it makes conversations a lot easier. Other topics to be aware of, minimum parking standards. There are a lot of communities that are actually eliminating parking standards. I've kind of come around to thinking this is maybe a good idea. Believe it or not, parking standards were developed in like the 70s based on some very, very, very small number of parking studies that were ever done. And they've just sort of like perpetuated over the decades. And what planners are really, really good at is copying stuff that other planners have done. So more than likely, your parking standards came from somebody else who got theirs from somebody else who got theirs from somebody else, and nobody really knows where they came from. And you can look at parking standards from different communities for the same use, and they're all over the map. And none of it really makes any sense. So I've kind of come around to is looking at eliminating parking minimums a good thing. Because in a lot of cases, if somebody wants parking, they know how much they need. Parking obviously takes up valuable land that could be used for something else. And the last thing anyone wants to see is a store with a sea of empty parking that's just causing environmental issues. It's causing heat island issues. It's not generating any income tax if you're a community, and it's generating very little property tax if you're a township. So something to keep in mind. Infill development, again, that kind of goes back to the idea, if you have a space in your community that is within a neighborhood or it's within a commercial area and it's been vacant for forever and nobody's done anything with it, more than likely, especially as expensive as development has become, those infill sites are looking more and more attractive. So I highly recommend taking a look at those and doing short-term studies, land use studies about what does the community maybe want to see in that space before somebody comes up with something that you have to react to. Work from home is a big issue, only from if you have a downtown or if you have a large commercial environment or retail environment, that's obviously being hurt. If you have a lot of folks who formerly came into your community and spent money at your businesses, you may not have as much as that. So that's certainly a zoning issue when you have a lot of vacant storefronts and things like that. EV charging, a lot of that just really has to do with, some new land uses want to have EV charging. Some communities have rules against like signage on EV charging and where it can be located. Some folks find the units just ugly and they don't want to see them maybe in the front yards or in certain locations. So if that's certainly a pinch or a pain point for you, make your staff aware. Climate impacts, a lot of this has to do, a lot of climate impacts kind of related to this is kind of stormwater detention, retention. A lot of the stormwater regulations were developed at a time where, decades ago when the climate was just flat out different. And some of those regulations may be out of date as a result, so that's something to take a look at in your code. Chat GPT and AI, I put that in there mostly because there are a lot of staff who are writing reports and stuff using Chat GPT and AI. I don't do that. I don't recommend folks do that, but it's the younger generation. They're much more comfortable doing that sort of thing. So just when you're reading these reports and something looks a little funny or whatever, or doesn't really make sense, it's okay. I don't know. It's okay to talk to your township administrator, talk to your city manager to say, hey, I don't really understand what's going on in this report. Maybe this tool was used and it was a cut and paste sort of thing and nobody really read it. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. Electric vehicle takeoff and landing, so that's the vertical takeoff vehicles. Whether or not that has a land use impact, that's probably decades out, but I don't know, just something to keep in mind that may come to a community near you. Some certification, professional development, just real quickly. The top 4 items, your national planning conferences, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana planning conference, the state planning conference for Ohio. Those are great opportunities for your staff to go out and learn what's happening in planning and zoning in the greater in the greater nation, the greater world. So I certainly encourage you folks to invest in training for your planning and zoning folks and allow them to attend some of these events. The fourth bullet point, planning and zoning workshop, that is right here in Dayton at Sinclair Community College. I encourage anyone, elected or appointed, to come to this event. It's very inexpensive. It's always the first Friday in December, and it's a great way to learn about what's going on in planning and zoning in this region and in the state as a whole. So it's a tremendous resource. And as a non-member, it's only $75. You get free parking and a fantastic lunch. It's like the highlight of the whole day. You get a great lunch, and you might win a door prize while you're at it, but you might learn a thing or two while you're there as well. So it's the first Friday in every December. I certainly encourage your attendance. Some other, the APA Passport, Zoning Practice, Planning magazines, those are items available from the American Planning Association. Again, those, if you have staff, I'd encourage them to read those. Again, I'm the section director of APA Ohio Miami Valley section. That's just our local professional development organization that's tied to the state chapter. And then AICP, that does not mean any idiot can plan. That is the American Institute of Certified Planners. And I am an AICP member. That's the highest credential that we have in planning. I would certainly encourage your staff to be AICP. If they are not, encourage them to become AICP. It just is sort of that stamp that says that you're a certified planner and that you're being up to date with the most recent issues in planning and zoning. So I'll leave you with a couple of do's and don'ts. Don't shoot the messenger. Staff are advisors. We are not advocates. Your staff should be there to provide you information. Oh, there's my timer. They should be there to provide you information. They should not be advocating for a specific position. Now, they may recommend a position, but they should not be advocates. They are simply there to provide you information. Whether or not you take their advice, my salary is not based on how many things get approved in a year. My personal worth isn't generated from how many cases get approved at the city council. So again, they're meant, ask them questions, probe for answers, but again, they're not there to advocate on behalf of the applicant or the community. They're there to provide you information so you can make the best decision you can. Please read the staff report. I've been in meetings where I've walked in and they like tearing open the envelope and just taking it out right there. And this is like, oh, well, you can already tell how this is going to go. So a good report will answer a lot of those basic questions. It'll make your meetings a lot shorter. And then it shows support for your staff. They put in a ton of work to put these documents together. And as a staff person, I just ask to show them the respect of coming in prepared for the meeting and ready to engage with the applicant, with the staff person, and make a decision that's informed. Don't take analyses or comments at face value. Please ask probing questions, not only of your staff, but also the folks who show up, the angry folks who show up. A lot of that testimony is taken as fact, and I think it's a detriment to the land use decision-making process. So please don't take comments at face value from anybody. Make sure that you're asking probing questions and getting clarification. Again, like I said before, do make those decisions based upon the record and using that as codified standards or criteria for review. Make your decisions based on the record. I can't express that enough because you definitely don't want to get in legal trouble for not doing so. And then don't ignore those flashpoint issues, those hot topics. Make sure you kind of keep your thumb on those, really understand what those issues are and how they're going to impact land use at the local level. So those are just a few of the do's and don'ts that I ask. Just a few resources to go over. The top two are organizations, the national organization and the Ohio Planning, that's our state chapter. Planetizen is kind of it's a planning and zoning news collection site. So they have articles from all over the country that talk about planning and zoning issues in planning and zoning. Plannersweb.com is a really cool website. Check that one out. It's no longer updated, but all that information there, it talks about how to be, as a citizen planner, how to interact with planning and zoning in your community. That's a tremendous website and a really good resource and great writing. So I really recommend that one. And if you really want to geek out, A Guide to Planning in Ohio. This was just published by the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association. This talks all about the rules and some of the guidelines, the rules and regulations, and what we do for planning in Ohio. So it's only $30, and I certainly encourage your staff to have a copy, and if you're interested, I would certainly recommend that you get a copy as well. It's a really good resource for planning and zoning. So with that, I think my time's up. I hope I answered everyone's questions, but if we have like a minute or two, I suppose we can answer questions. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
In my experience with Oakwood, I did some zoning work. And I would say that the folks in your planning and zoning departments, they have to have pretty thick skin because they're taking on developers, and in a lot of cases they're taking on angry residents who don't want a particular project or a particular development. Probably the most hated person in your community is the code enforcement officer. And if he or she is not hated in your community, they are not doing their job because they're doing
Amen,
nothing
Jay.
but giving people bad news, asking them to spend money, and asking them to do things that they really should be doing, but they're not doing. So just keep that in mind when you're at the bank or the grocery store and somebody's in your ear about your planners or your code enforcement officers. Just look at that with a jaundiced eye. So,
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it.
thanks, Andrew.